Karen Beluso, the president-elect of NENIC, and I'm excited to present the next presenter. And so for today, we have a special performance of Florence Nightingale, performed by Kathy Duckett. Most of us know Florence Nightingale as the mother of modern nursing. However, she was also important to the field of nursing informatics. Florence is with us today to talk about the importance of informatics in her work and share her thoughts of what it means for nursing today and in the future. So please welcome Florence Nightingale, performed by Kathy Duckett.
The subject that is near and dear to my heart is that of statistics, and more specifically, medical statistics, as used by nurses to improve the lives of patients. These days, it is not unusual for a woman to study mathematics and statistics, and you have heard from some extraordinary women already, and this first annual award, how exciting and wonderful. But in my day, women were not thought capable of learning much more than needlepoint and quadrilles. It was 1832, after all. I was brought up in a life of privilege and was expected to learn how to be a proper lady, marry well, and produce progeny. I was not expected to learn anything of importance. It was my father who convinced my mother to allow my sister Parthy and me to be tutored and to study as if we were boys instead of girls. He had no sons, so he treated us as such and opened our world to mathematics, history, and science. My sister preferred needlepoint. I preferred mathematics. In time, I had learned all my father could teach me and was permitted to have a mathematical tutor. One of my tutors was Mr. J.J. Sylvester. Dear Mr. Sylvester. It was he who coined the phrase graph and who was fundamental in the development of matrix theory. Here in the Americas, you may know him best as the founder of the American Journal of Mathematics. His tutelage served me well when in 1854, at 24, I led a group of 38 nurses to care for our soldiers in the Crimean War. Today, we live in an age when physicians and nurses are thought of as a clinical team. In my day, it was not that way. God had called me to be a nurse. But in 1851, the only nurses in England were prostitutes, or those too weak, too old, too drunken, too stupid, too bad, or too dirty to do anything else. You can imagine my mother's reaction when I, the eldest daughter, told her I wanted to become a nurse. She nearly fainted. I had visited the convent in Kaiserwerth, Germany, and saw the nurses perform the duties of a nurse as God has intended. I convinced my mother and father to allow me to study at Kaiserwerth and came back to England convinced that I would be able to change the course of nursing in England. In 1853, I received my first position as superintendent at the Hospital for Invalid Gentlewomen. I immediately began making some much-needed reforms. The hospital stayed within budget for the first time in its history. The Women's Board thought I was too radical because I insisted that the nurses not sleep with the patients. What good is a nurse who is sicker than her patients? I calmly inquired of them. I wanted them to have their own rooms where they could pray and contemplate and prepare. I put ropes by the patient's bed that led to bells in the kitchens so they could call for a nurse whenever they needed one. And just when things were going well, Sidney Herbert came to see me. I had met Sidney when we were both traveling in Italy years earlier, and we had become fast friends. But now he was Secretary at War and having problems with the Crimea. That was before the charge of the Light Brigade, when the heroics of our soldiers was merely a rumor. When the idea of sending nurses to the Crimea arose, Sidney thought of me. I must admit, I am not certain he had sufficiently thought it through. The only reason we were going to the Crimea was because the French had sent nurses, so of course the English must as well. Sidney assured me that I would have plenary authority over all the nurses and the fullest assistance and cooperation from the medical staff. He also promised me unlimited power of drawing on the government for whatever I think requisite for the success of the mission. We would serve under the Army's direction. Those military doctors did not want us there and had no idea what to do with us. I cannot sufficiently describe to you the horrors of the war. When we arrived, we found the men in the most shocking and appalling circumstances. There were over 2,000 men in hospital, 120 cholera patients, and 650 severely wounded in a second hospital known as the General Hospital. On the day we arrived, so had an additional 510 wounded from the dreadful affair at Balaclava, where 12,763 were wounded and 442 killed. There were over 4 miles of beds, not 18 inches apart. I had to order my nurses not to wear petticoats of any kind because the dresses would brush against the beds and wake the men. I remember walking through the wards and looking at a man sleeping on a wooden divan. The boards under the thin bedding were rotten, crawling with termites, ants, alive with vermin, and saturated with everything offensive. The orderlies told me they could not be kept clean. They said that if they washed the boards, they would never be dried again. The bed clothing was keeping in all other aspects of the place. 70% of all deaths were because of the care the men received in our hospitals. Very shortly upon arriving, it became clear that the war would have been won except for the Army medical establishment. It also became abundantly clear early on that the care of the men was the least of the Army's concerns. I discovered that the Army was awash in a sea of paperwork. Each orderly filed a form with 3 signatures for each individual meal that was sent to each patient in hospital. That was over 2,000 requisitions for every meal. I suggested that the orderlies sign out all the food for everyone on 1 requisition. Then doctors could attach a piece of paper to every bed, which would have on it the diet of each patient, so the orderly could come with the food and give to each man as they were prescribed on the paper. Some men did not receive their evening meal until well after 10 p.m., and they had received their previous meal at 8 a.m. There was a paper for everything. For the bed the patient lay upon, another for his blanket, another for his bandages, another for his gown, another for his pillow if he had one, another for his spoon, another for his knife, another for his fork, and it did not end. I suggested to give every man 1 requisition for everything he might need in his stay. None of my suggestions were accepted by the Army medical establishment in the Crimea. Now, one would have thought that with the Army's love of paperwork, the statistics kept by the Army would have been impeccable. One would have been wrong. The statistical carelessness was unforgivable. The medical records were deplorable, and none had been maintained in anything approaching a uniform manner. There was no standard or consistent reporting between hospitals. Each hospital had its own separate system of naming and classifying diseases tabulated on different forms. Even the numbers of death was not accurate prior to my arrival. Hundreds of men were buried, but their deaths were never recorded. I must say that I am disheartened that over 150 years later, we as nurses are still dealing with these same issues of no standard reporting between hospitals and a lack of consistency in forms and charting between institutions and services. It does appear your current armed forces, with their uniform electric health record, is ahead of some of the rest of your country's medical establishments. Wasn't the EHR expected to make our work easier? Wasn't it supposed to make it simple to communicate quickly and share patient information so that all the information we need to care for a patient is at our fingertips, regardless of where we meet the patient, whether it be hospital, physician practice, clinic, or home health care? Although there are some shining stars, I am dismayed to see that the lack of standard reporting between institutions has continued in so many areas of American healthcare today. I am much more pleased with the British National Health Service and the work they have done to connect the healthcare of their country electronically, but even there is still much work to do. But I digress. In the Crimea, it was immediately apparent that we would only be allowed to nurse if I used the gifts God had given me. That included not only ministering to the men's clinical needs, but ensuring they had enough food to eat, were fed on time, had clean linens, and that the men were bathed and the bandages changed on a regular basis. When we arrived, there were no washing facilities, and so we created them. The physicians felt that washing surgical instruments after each use and applying fresh, clean bandages over surgical wounds was a waste of time. So we ensured the surgical instruments were cleaned, and we changed the dressings. We cooked for the men, although it was difficult to find food worthy of cooking. When we arrived, many men were dying of starvation, and those that were getting food were dying of what they were eating. A man bit into what he thought was a bit of horse meat in his stew and discovered a nail. I am not unconvinced that some of the cooks mistook pieces of wood for the meat because the colors were about the same by the time the cooks got them, and they had the same number of insects inhabiting them. The men received no vegetables at all. A shipload of vegetables was sent to Balaclava, but from the orders it couldn't be deciphered whether it was to go to the officers or the soldiers. They threw all of it into the sea as to end the confusion and the debate. Sanitation was non-existent. There were 20 chamber pots for every 1,000 men. 30 patients were bathed every night in slipper baths. At that rate, every man would be washed once every 80 days. The consequences of this practice were fever, cholera, gangrene, lice, fleas, and erysipelas from the using of one sponge in the same water for all wounds. So, my nurses and I were cooks, housekeepers, scavengers, washerwomen, general dealers, and storekeepers, as well as nurses. But I believe the most important contribution I made was twofold. I wrote letters to my friends who had the power to change what I could not, and I kept meticulous records. I counted every wound, every patient, every pot, and I kept records of it all. I believed that it was important to understand the magnitude of what was happening so far away from English soil, and in order to do that, I must provide accurate information. In order to provide the information, I must produce accurate numbers, because I realized that it was not really about the numbers. They were the way I created the data I needed. But the data wasn't enough. I needed to have the data to provide the information. But the information was not the end goal. No. The information was needed to be in the right hands to accomplish the goal, to improve the lives of the soldiers. We needed to demonstrate that our intervention saved lives, not just a few, but many lives. The military doctors and generals were invested in the status quo. Men go to war, and most die. But the numbers revealed that we were losing more men to dysentery than in battle by a margin of 8-1. When I wrote to Sidney regarding sending a Sanitary Commission to the Crimea to assess conditions there, I was able to tell him that we had 39,000 men on our side of the Black Sea, and 25,000 of them were in hospital. I was able to tell him that most of the men in hospital, in fact, were not wounded, but sick with scurvy, frostbite, and dysentery, all preventable if men had simply received fresh food and blankets. The data was compelling, The Sanitary Commission arrived 6 months later, saw the deplorable conditions, read my statistics, and insisted on the reforms that I had been requesting from the first day of my arrival. Because the Sanitation Commission insisted, the reforms were implemented. As a result of the reforms of the Sanitary Commission, mortality fell from 42% to 2.2%, and deaths from preventable causes nearly ceased. Because of those successes, I was put in charge of the nursing for the entire campaign and was able to exact reforms throughout the Crimea. Our soldiers did not die, but instead survived. And after I had brought a retired school teacher to teach the recovering men how to read and write letters home, they returned to England better educated than they had left. But none of that would have been accomplished without data. I did not stop there. Despite my best efforts, thousands of men died needlessly from illness they acquired while in hospital. 73% in 8 regiments in 6 months from disease alone. I determined that more needed to be done. The entire British Army Medical Department must be reformed. I spoke with my friend, the great statistician William Farr, who encouraged me to focus on statistics. "We do not want impressions, we want facts," he said. The Times of London had changed the hearts of my countrymen with their stories of the war and of our work. But William was right. Stories connect with men and women's hearts, but statistics connect the dots. Real change only comes when one can prove the effect of one's work, and that can only happen through the use of data. There is much talk of population health these days. I find that amusing, as if thinking of what is best for the health of a population of people is a new concept. For what is population health but providing the best care for one person and doing that over and over again in a prescribed and predicted way? Not just this one time, in this one circumstance. Not just when I am well rested or have an easy patient or an easy situation to deal with, but over and over again. One patient becomes 2, 2 become 4, and eventually we have population health. And that is exactly what I intended to do when I reformed the Army medical establishment. I realized that in peacetime, soldiers in England died at twice the rate as civilians, even though they were young men in their prime. The problem was the military health service. The challenges ran far deeper than the deplorable conditions of hospitals during the war. Because of the work my nurses and myself had done, I gained some notoriety during my time in the Crimea. The Times had sent reporters to the war, and they had reported back on the work we were doing there and had set up a trust fund in my name to purchase supplies that we needed and that the Army could not or would not supply. Upon my return to England, I was honored to be invited to tea with the Queen. Queen Victoria was a wonderful and formidable ruler. She knew how to exert her influence to push for the reforms and advances that England sorely needed. Our tea was delightful, and I took the opportunity to share with Her Highness and Prince Albert some findings and my concerns. Well, to be exceedingly honest, I shared with both she and the Prince all that affected our military hospital system and suggested the reforms that were needed. The Queen and the Prince listened thoughtfully and determined that a royal commission should be formed to assess the effectiveness of the Army Medical Department. She suggested that I write a small report for the Royal Commission, sharing my thoughts and observations with them. I had kept data on everything in the Crimea, and my report, Notes on Matters Affecting the Health, Efficiency, and Hospital Administration of the British Army, was 830 pages. Full of statistics. But I feared that eyes would glaze over at the pages and pages of lists of numbers, and they would never get to the recommendations. William thought I shouldn't worry. He said statistics should be the driest of readings. But I thought he was wrong. The Royal Commission would have become lost in the numbers and nothing would have changed. Numbers alone are not enough. You must show the meaning behind the numbers, be able to demonstrate how to apply the statistics to interpret the meaning of the numbers. This was radical thinking in 1856. I was one of the first to apply statistics to support the findings of my report. I embraced the idea of my contemporary Adolphe Quintelet, the founder of social statistics, but I went farther, insisting that statistics should be used and understood by politicians and officials as a rational means for decision-making. The idea of bar graphs was very new, having been created only a few decades earlier. But I felt it wasn't dramatic enough to reveal the changes in deaths month over month, or the causes of death from disease versus wounds versus other causes. So I created what was eventually called the Cockscomb Diagram and what has also been referred to as the polar area graph. I created it by combining the principles of a pie chart and a bar graph. The chart was cut into 12 equal angles, and the slices advanced in a clockwise direction for each month of the year, from April 1854 through March of 1855, and then also from April of 1855 to March of 1856. Each slice illustrated the occurrences in 1 month of 1 year. The outward direction of each slice displayed how many deaths occurred each month. Each slice had 3 sections that resembled a bar graph, one for wounds in battle, one for disease, and one for other causes. It became apparent that even the charge of the Light Brigade yielded only a modest fraction of the total deaths in the month in which it occurred. These diagrams demonstrated clearly and without any doubt the causes of mortality during the war and the effect that sanitation had changing the cause of death before and after the Sanitation Commission's reforms. The graph eloquently demonstrated that the Russians were a minor foe. The real enemy was disease and the army medical establishment. The diagrams allowed the viewer to focus on the implication of the data. Much like a prism allows all aspects of the light to be clearly seen and differentiated, the graph allowed the viewer to connect the different statistics to understand the trending of the data and how various occurrences, such as the charge of the Light Brigade or the Battle of Sevastopol and the Sanitary Commission reforms, affected the mortality rates. Looking at my diagrams, there was no denying the impact of the care or lack of that was provided by the Army medical establishment and the impact of the changes resulting from the reforms set in motion by the Sanitary Commission, as well as the increasing influence the nursing establishment had on enacting and enforcing those reforms in hospitals throughout the Crimea. My nursing expertise informed all aspects of the report, and with the diagrams presenting the statistics, they combined to create a compelling case for the Royal Commission and led to systemic changes in the Army medical establishment. By the end of the century, Army mortality was lower than civilian mortality. Based upon the success of my report to the Royal Commission, I created the term applied statistics to explain the need for teaching how to use statistics in order to legislate for and to administer our national life with more precision and experience. Statistics became a powerful tool for reform then and remains so today. Nursing informatics. A specialty that integrates nursing science, computer science, and information science to manage and communicate data, information, knowledge, and wisdom in nursing practice. I recently read the response from Mr. Mark Shagru and Ms. Joy Sensmeyer to the American Nursing Association's call for public comment regarding the second edition of the Nursing Informatics Scope and Standards of Practice. It was published in January 2014 on the HIMSS website. I'm sure you've all seen it. Well, I was heartened to read Mr. Chagru and Ms. Sensmeyer's comments that they felt the, quote, proposed definition has a heavy emphasis on data. Data are merely the tools used to analyze workflow change and improve patient safety. The definition and role of a nurse informaticist should be expanded to improve patient care and outcomes through the use of data and other tools, end quote. They went on to say, quote, NI has advanced to enhancing and optimizing technology and informatics tools that help clinicians provide better care and positive health outcomes, end quote. Mr. Chagru and Mrs. Sensmeyer went to the heart of the matter when they stated, the interpretation of data using clinical knowledge is pivotal to the role of the informatics nurse, and this responsibility is critical to promoting quality outcomes. My heart was gladdened when I read those words. I understand that they were summarizing the comments that were made by many of you here today in response to the ANA guidelines. I applaud you for your constancy in standing for what is the basis of all nursing, to provide safe, effective patient care with a focus on positive health outcomes. It is all any of us should aspire to and why we nurse. Envy is a sin, and so I try not to be envious. But I must admit to you that it is sometimes a challenge when I see all that you have available at your fingertips. You have computers. You have software applications that crunch. Oh, I just love that term, crunch. Crunch the numbers quickly and efficiently. But computers do not yet have what you as nurses have. The ability to take the data and see how it will affect living, breathing people. Because at the end of the day, that is why we do this, isn't it? It isn't to say, well, isn't that an interesting statistic? What differentiates we nurses from all other statisticians? Our clinical judgment. These numbers that we analyze are not, These numbers that we analyze are not just ticks on a page. They are individuals. They are our mothers, fathers, children, aunts, and uncles. They are more than just numbers. And our sacred duty as nurses is to provide them with the best care possible. We bring to the data the understanding of the implication of these numbers. We bring to the data the clinical, critical thinking needed to make meaningful changes, to provide truly person-centered, evidence-based care, and to improve the lives of the patients we are privileged to care for. Oh, pardon me. I get very emotional about this. Where do I see the future in this for nursing informatics? Your Institute of Medicine's 2001 Crossing the Quality Chasm report stated that your healthcare delivery system was irretrievably broken. It went on to say that in order to fix it, you would need to foster the use of information technology in clinical care and make it easy to do the right thing. In the Institute of Medicine's 2010 report on the future of nursing, leading change, advancing health, the first key message was that nurses should practice to the full extent of their education and training. In order to do this, we must empower nurses to use all the tools at their disposal, including information technology, to make it easy to do the right thing. I believe the Tiger Initiative is leading us into the future. The Technology Informatics Guiding Education Reform, TIGER. What a wonderful acronym for such an exciting endeavor. Ms. Bell discussed earlier what the current recommendations are, and all are admirable. I particularly preferred one goal, this perspicacious goal, to identify information and knowledge management best practices and effective technology capabilities for nurses to create and disseminate action plans that can be duplicated within nursing and other multidisciplinary settings. Creating and disseminating action plans that can be duplicated. Yes. I am delighted that this is your goal. I tried to create duplicatable standards in my small way with my notes on nursing and my letters to my sister nurses around the world that were trying to promote the profession of nursing and to create schools of nursing that would teach the same principles for consistency of care. But that was a small effort compared to what you will be able to accomplish. As nursing moves forward in the 21st century, we must use the gifts that God has given all of us: our compassion, our critical thinking, our ability to look at the patient holistically and combine those with the tremendous force of technology available to us today to enable every nurse to have the information and decision support tools at their fingertips, which will allow each to practice at the full extent of her or his education and training. You are here today because you are leading us into the future with the work that you do. My work was the beginning. Your work is the future. Brava and bravo. Thank you all, and Godspeed.
Please let me introduce the actress and the nurse here with us, and Kathy Duckett. Kathy is the Director of Training and Development at Sutter Care at Home Center for Integrated Care. She has been in nursing for over 30 years, specializing in home health care. Florence Nightingale allows Kathy to combine her two great loves, acting and nursing, in a way that is entertaining and enlightening. Please, let's give a round of appreciation for Florence and Kathy. Excellent.